hanging around in the background of these two Bible stories. The actual word itself wasn't in either story, but you heard it hanging around there. The word unclean. Any images come to mind? Any smells, any sounds, any sense about something or other with that word unclean? I'll tell you what comes to my mind. Those Febreze commercials on television. You know the ones where they blindfold somebody and ask them, what do you smell? And you take a deep breath, put your blindfolds, you can't see anything, and they smell lilacs, they smell vanilla, they smell a nice warm summer, spring day, whatever. And then after they've gone on and on about this wonderful sensation of beautiful smells, they ask them to take off the blindfolds, and the room is just putrid, vile, dirty, rotten. When I hear the word unclean, I think about that particular commercial on the TV and all of the kinds of images that get associated with those kinds of spots in our lives. Those vile, dirty, putrid, there's nothing desirable. The word itself is even an ugly word. You almost don't want to say the word. It's right at the heart of what we're talking about in today's text. If you are willing, the man said to Jesus, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And the problem wasn't that the guy needed to take a shower. I don't know whether he needed to or not. He might have. But the problem wasn't that he needed a shower. And he is not simply talking about physical healing. In some of the versions of the English Bible, the word, instead of saying, you can make me clean, in some of the versions it says, you can make me well. As though this were a physical problem, a medical problem, which it was, but that isn't really what all is going on here. Something much bigger than a medical problem is going on here. It was a medical problem, you can be sure of that. It was maybe the disease that is technically called leprosy. It might have been that. Or in the Bible, very often the word leprosy includes a whole bunch of skin infections and rashes and all those kinds of irritating kinds of things. Eczema, all those sorts of itchy, nasty kinds of skin diseases. All of them were sort of lumped together under the word leprosy. And the fact that they were a medical problem was only the beginning of the thing. You see, they didn't know what to do. If they knew what to do with the disease, you got cured and that was that. But if they didn't know what to do with the disease, it very quickly became a social problem. It very quickly became an emotional problem, a relational problem. It even became a religious problem because they didn't know what else to do with you, so they sent you out of the community, out to live way over there someplace with whoever else might have a similar kind of disease and who had also been exiled away from the community. So it really became much more than just a medical problem because now you are cut off from your family, you are cut off from your friends, you are cut off from your community, you are cut off from your church, you're cut off from everybody way out over there, lost in some terrible kinds of ways. And so you can understand why this man really does want Jesus to make me clean, if you are willing. Make me clean. Never thought terribly much about that until in one of my churches, a couple of churches back, there was a man named Ray. Ray was in his 80s. Ray got some kind of an infection, and they didn't know what the infection was, and they tried this and that to treat it, and nothing was working right, and they began to get nervous about this infection and the fact that they couldn't respond to it in a good way. So they put Ray in an isolation unit in the hospital, and it was serious isolation. He was locked up in that room by himself, and every person who went into that room, no matter whether you were a doctor, a nurse, the person who brought him lunch, the person who went in to clean the room, a family member, a friend, a pastor, every person who went into that room, first of all, had to put on one of those ugly yellow plastic gowny things. Some of you had to put those on, and a face mask, and the latex gloves. And so and Ray was there for a long time, several weeks, maybe even almost a month. He was in this isolation unit. They couldn't figure out what was going on. And every person who went in to treat him or to visit him or to care for him or to have any contact with him at all, every person who went into that room had a mask, had a gown, had gloves. And so for that whole entire time, Ray never saw a full human face. He never felt the touch of human skin. The faces were all what you could see over the top of the mask. The skin was all covered by latex. When this thing finally broke, and they never did figure out what was going on, when the thing finally broke and Ray was up in that isolation room, went to visit him, and he said, "Pastor, you can't even begin to imagine how good it feels to see a whole human face. You can't even begin to imagine how wonderful it feels to feel the touch of actual human skin after all of that time of not seeing the face, of not feeling skin, after all of that time." And he told me that this medical precaution, this isolation, starts to play on your mind after a while. For a while you can sort of put up with it, and it's okay, and yeah, you get by. But after a while you begin to feel untouchable. You begin to feel dirty. You begin to feel unfit for human contact, and you begin to feel like you're sort of being boxed out of the rest of the world. And literally you are. You're isolated in that room. And it starts to create some emotional distress and some spiritual distress. And it's hard on your relationship with your friends and your family. It starts to create a lot of pain. It starts to create shame, some sense of feeling unworthy. Really starts to mess with your head, he told me. And so you can understand why Ray could resonate with that gospel story that we just heard. The story about the man who wanted to be made clean, because Ray wanted to be made clean. He wanted those barriers that isolated him to be taken away. The physical barrier of the room and the latex gloves and the face mask and all the rest of it. The physical barriers to be taken away. He yearned to be set free. Desperately he wanted somebody to take the barriers down, to get rid of what separated him from everybody else. And in the middle of it all, he found himself wishing that somebody would become a transgressor. Walk into that room without the gloves and without the mask. Break the rules, a transgressor, so that he could actually have human contact again. Who are the unclean people in our culture? Who are the unclean people, the untouchable people for us? Who are the people who are over there someplace on the other side of the boundary? Remember, fairly early on in my ministry, as this whole thing called AIDS was beginning to get an awful lot of traction, we had a lot of discussions with pastors and chaplains and so on about how do you respond to people who have AIDS, because very soon we were going to be in that spot. And in fact, we have been, all of us who have been in ministry any time at all. How do you respond to somebody who has AIDS? Do you shake hands with them? Do you hug them? In the pastoral ways that you minister to the sick, do you touch them with the oil of blessing, or touch them when you pray with them? What do you do with somebody who has AIDS? Because you see, for a pastor, for many of us at least, it isn't just putting myself at risk. It's a question of putting myself at risk because it impacts my wife and my children and my family and all the rest of it. So it isn't such a simple question. Or what about people with certain kinds of disabilities? You see some of those people and you just sort of involuntarily pull back. You have, and so have I. Or people with certain kinds of emotional things or mental things. What about certain kinds of things? Someone in my family who was convicted of molesting children, and something tightens in my gut just to think about his name. You know what I'm talking about. And even a more simple kind of thing. When I was in college, I worked in a lumber yard during the summer. I'd wait on customers who came in to buy whatever they needed to buy at the lumber yard. And there were, after a while, you begin to do this, and those of you who have worked in retail or customer service, you know what I'm talking about. Certain customers would walk in the door, and you would immediately go over here and get very, very busy in something else over here, so that you were too busy to somebody else had to wait on that customer. And you didn't want to wait on them. You know what I'm talking about. You've been there, some of you. It's that kind of thing. Some of the boundaries are necessary. Some of the boundaries need to be there. In the biblical world, that boundary that put the person with leprosy way over there away from you, it needed to be there because they didn't know what else to do. They didn't know how to treat the disease. They didn't know how to stop it from spreading to somebody else. That was the only thing they knew. So for the time, at least, it needed to be that kind of a boundary. And you can't have violent people running around loose. You can't have child molesters teaching Sunday school. We all know about boundaries, and we know that they need to be there. But sometimes the boundaries are unnecessary. We create them out of fear. We create them perhaps for the sake of convenience. We create them sometimes to protect a certain bias that we have. We create them sometimes so we don't have to deal with somebody who is different somehow from us. And then to keep the wall standing, we have to put up a no trespassing sign, because we got to keep the unclean people over there away from us somehow. Don't let them come over here. You got to keep the wall intact. I was thinking about all this. I began to remember the Robert Frost poem, and some of you are already having it rattle around in your heads too. Remember it. Something there is that doesn't love a wall. Something there is that doesn't love a wall. And as the poet and his neighbor are out there working on rebuilding the wall, the neighbor reminds him that, well, but yes, good fences make good neighbors. But Robert Frost can't quite get that notion through his head. He keeps coming back to the notion that there's something in nature that doesn't love a wall. And so he says, well, if we're going to maintain the wall, we need to know what we are walling in or what we are walling out. Mark's gospel seems to have a sense for some of that stuff. Mark seems to be one of those people who is always pushing the boundaries. And he tells all of these stories about Jesus sort of reaching across the wall or breaking the wall down or reaching out to somebody who shouldn't be reaching out or breaking down some kind of a rule. For example, when we're only at the end of chapter 1 and already 2 healings have happened on Sabbath. We're supposed to do that stuff on Sabbath day. That was supposed to be done some other day. Already in chapter 1, 2 healings have happened on Sabbath day. And already in chapter 1, Jesus has reached across a cultural boundary, a medical boundary, to touch a man who had leprosy. And he will sit and eat with the tax collectors and the sinners. Mark won't even let a building stand in the way. You remember that story? It comes at the beginning of chapter 2. Jesus has come back home to Capernaum, and he's in a house teaching and preaching. And people have come. The house is jam-packed. People are falling out the front door. They're falling out the back door. They're hanging out the windows. The house is jammed full of people. And 4 guys hear that Jesus is there, and they remember their friend who is paralyzed, can't walk, can't move. So they put their friend on a stretcher, these 4 guys, and they pick the stretcher up, and they run to the house where Jesus is, only to find there's absolutely no way to get in the house. Remember the story? So what did they do? They make sure the building is no longer in the way. They go up on the roof of the house, they tear the roof open, and they plop the guy down right on Jesus' head, right? So the building can't even stand in the way of the opportunity for Jesus to do what needs to be done. And when Jesus saw the faith of these men, the story will tell us that Jesus forgave the man's sin and healed the man so that he could take up his bed and work his way through the crowd and walk on home. Because Jesus doesn't want walls getting in the way, especially walls that are built out of unclean stone. Ever been on the wrong side of one of those walls? Walls built out of unclean stone. It happens pretty easily. It happens pretty often. Sometimes we build a wall that shouldn't be there. Sometimes somebody else builds a wall that shouldn't be there. And either way, we end up on a wall that either shouldn't be on the wrong side of a wall that either shouldn't be there in the first place, or a wall that has somehow outlived its legitimate usefulness, but we're still on the wrong side of it. You probably have stories to tell, and so do I. Most of them are stories that we probably shouldn't tell in public. But the uncleanness takes its toll. The uncleanness takes its toll on our souls. The uncleanness takes its toll on our relationships. We wonder if ever it will be different. We wonder if ever it could change. What happened in this gospel story? What happened in this gospel story? What was Jesus willing to do? What did Jesus choose to do? In the story, Jesus reached out and touched the unclean man. And having touched the unclean man, he makes him clean, which restores the man in all kinds of ways. The man is now able to come back and live in community. He's able to come back and live in relationship. He's able to come back and have contact now with his family and with his friends. He's able now to live in communion with God and the community of God's people. Jesus reaches out and lifts the man up and cleans him and makes him clean and returns him to where he belongs. He's able now to come back home. He's able now to come back home. Now there's no magic here. There's no broom that sort of magically sweeps away all the dirt. That's not what's going on here. What's going on here is something quite different. There is someone who is willing. There is someone who chooses to reach out. The one who is willing, the one who chooses, is the powerful one, the beloved Son upon whom God's Spirit rests, the one who brings near the kingdom of God, the one whose name is Jesus, the one who says, I am willing. I am willing. When there's a will like that, there will be a way. There will be a way. Let us pray. Embrace our wills to do your will, Lord Jesus, so that we may be willing to participate in the work by which you make people clean. Help us to offer and receive forgiveness. Help us to recognize and tear down the walls that ought not be left standing. Help us know how best to maintain the walls that must remain. By your grace and by your power, restore and renew what the uncleanness has destroyed. So may we bear witness to your saving presence.